Hey, I'm Caleb from YouCanMakeThisToo. Thank you for joining me. Today's project's one I've been excited about for a while. It's my first big boy style hand-tool workbench. I have plans available for this on my website if you're interested, and they'll be at a 25% pre-order discount for a while. But with that, stick with me and I'll show you how you can make this too.
The first bit of this, you'll be seeing me break down and mill the materials for the top of the bench, some old cypress barn beams, and some walnut. I'll link below to a video I did on the milling process if you're not familiar with it, but it's basically just making lumber be flat, straight, and square. If these pieces seem a bit large for a workbench top though, it's because they are. Now, I don't do a whole lot of hand tool work, and I do have a small shop, so I'm going to make a fairly small bench, only about 2 foot by 4 foot. Now, besides the obvious size limitations of a bench that small, one of the downsides is it won't be very heavy if I build it to normal proportions. So, I'm way oversizing all of the components. Not because they need to be that large for strength, but simply to add mass. But then I also drive an oversized truck, so draw your own conclusions. These beams had some pretty severe cracking that I decided to stabilize. They probably would have been fine, but since I'll be beating on this bench pretty good, I don't want to press my luck. I stabilized them using Total Boat 2-to-1 epoxy and used some dental syringes to help me really get the epoxy in the cracks easier without wasting a lot of it. This is my first time using the Total Boat epoxy, and it flows a lot better than the other epoxy I've used before, but it still takes a while for it to seep into these cracks, so it took me a couple of sessions to get them filled up all the way. After the epoxy was done, I milled the last side of the beams at the table saw and then jointed it with my hand plane so I could get the best glue seam possible. You may be wondering why the walnut racing stripes on the top. If not, you should be. Unlike an import car, they won't make this bench go any faster. The reality is my cypress beams finished out a little narrower than I needed them to be able to fit my end vise, and I thought the spacers would look better in the middle than on the outside. But why walnut? Isn't that a waste of expensive lumber? Well, yeah, but I threw some walnut trim on my assembly table when I built it because I had some awkward scrap, and then it went onto my router table to match. And now it's an expensive shop furniture theme that I'm committed to seeing through. I mean, nobody likes a quitter. Once the top was glued on, I needed to square off the ends and cut it to length. I started this process by making the cut with my track saw and then cutting the rest of the depth by hand. Then I remembered that I have a sliding miter saw, so I carried it over there and lucked out. My saw was able to cut through the entire depth, but didn't slide far enough to cut the whole thing. So I flipped it over and cut from the other side, and that left me just a little bit to cut off by hand on the other end. For work holding, I'm going to have 2 vices on this bench, a quick release end vise from Rockler and a leg vise. The end vise gets attached to the bottom of the bench, so I figured it'd be easiest to work on that while the top is still kinda mobile. I started by adding a vise face piece to the bench with some long lag screws, and then just followed the directions that came with the vise, which is basically just drilling some through holes and some pilot holes for screws and screwing everything together. A few handy tips though is you can use a Forstner bit or brad point bit the same size as a hole in a piece of hardware to transfer the location of that hole to what you need to drill, and you'll get the exact center marked. That's a lot more accurate than just guessing with a pencil. Also, if you're drilling big holes and don't want blowout on either side, then you can either clamp a spoil board onto the backside where your drill is going to bust through the wood, or as soon as you see the tip of the bit starting to come out the wood, stop and drill from the other side. That's what I did on this. And once the vise was all assembled, I planed the bottom of both of the vise faces flush. Now it's time to work on the base. This will be all made from red oak. Most of it's from a red oak that I got from a tree service locally just for this project a few years ago. I did that so I could have hefty single piece legs. Now my chainsaw work isn't so great though, so they needed a lot of work at the jointer to get a flat face. And then I used my bandsaw to hog off most of the waste before milling them square, but you could easily laminate up some legs this size. I didn't have enough red oak from that tree to do the long stretchers, so I laminated together some scrap red oak from another project to be the long stretchers. And to keep myself straight, I laid out my legs to figure out which would be the outside faces, and then rough marked where each joint will be cut on the legs. The base will be lap joints, which means I'm just cutting notches into the legs that the stretchers will fit into. Now the rough marks just make sure that I cut on the correct side of each leg. I use this new fancy double marking gauge to mark the actual cut lines. The nice thing about using marking gauges is there's no math to mess up, and because the dimension is duplicated instead of measured, the marks are stupid accurate. To cut the joints, I set the depth of cut at my table saw to the thickness of the stretchers, and then made a series of cuts where the notch goes. This would have been a lot faster with a dado stack, but I wanted to show it can be done with a regular blade. And it should be easy to imagine how you could easily do this with a circular saw, or even a hand saw if tennis elbow is your thing. To remove the little pieces left behind, I just beat them with a hammer, and then pried them with a screwdriver to break them loose, and used a chisel to smooth out the bottom. The top stretchers will be flush with the top of the legs, so when I cut those, I make sure to take a cut at the very top. If I didn't, when I broke out that top chip, there's no guarantee that it would break off flush with the bottom. It may break out more wood than I want. Now, it's not entirely likely, but that one careful cut is really cheap insurance. I did have a little accident that chewed up part of one leg, but fortunately it was a pretty easy repair. I just cut out the leg flush with the joint and then clamped a stretcher in place and glued an offcut from the stretcher as a patch. I used 5-minute epoxy for its quick setup time so I could keep moving, and after letting it cure for a while, I cut the patch flush with the bottom of the leg, and now there's no telling there was ever a repair. Next is the base glue up. So I cut the stretchers to length and then glue and clamp it all together. The joints are tight enough there's not really room for things to be out of square, but I keep checking square as I go anyway. I let the glue dry overnight and then sanded the base down before dyeing it ebony. If watching hardwood get dyed is the kind of thing that gets your blood pressure up, you might want to subscribe and then click away from this video before you see how I attach the top. Feel free to leave me a comment about how these L brackets ruined this entire project and I should have done some through dovetail tenons. Now, those are an amazing way to build a bench, but I have a base with fairly wet lumber and a very dry top, so I needed a good way to let the base and top move independent from each other. Also, tops are normally laminated with a grain in such a way that seasonal movement just changes the thickness of the top. Because I use those big beams, which saved me a small fortune in glue and time spent clamping glue ups, my bench is not going to move that way. With the bench top mounted, I cut the ends of the vise face flush with the bench top and then set to smoothing the top. If you want details on this process, J-Bates did an amazing video on how to do it. But basically, I just started with a scrub plane and worked across the workbench top, then diagonally along the top. Then I switched to my jointer plane and went diagonally again, and then along its length, and finished up with a smoothing plane. An alternative would have been setting up a router sled and flattening it with a router, but that makes a huge mess, and if you're building a hand tool bench, you probably have hand planes, so yeah. I want dog holes in this bench every 4 inches, so I set up a quick jig and put a bushing in it. This will give me consistent spacing and keep my holes vertical. Now I got a massive brad point bit and this bushing from Lee Valley, and they fit each other perfect. I'll have a link below to those. Now, the one thing to drilling holes like this is make sure to remove the bit frequently to clear out all the chips. And then with that all done, I go ahead and rub on several coats of boiled linseed oil and then paste wax. I still need to build the leg vise for this beast. Earlier, I laminated together a walnut blank for the vise chop. I measure it from the bench and cut it to length. I wanted to give my chop a nice pleasing shape, so the first thing I did was taper the sides. I started with my scrub plane to hog off the material until the edge was parallel with my line and there was only about an 1/8 inch of material left to remove. Then I switched to my jointer plane and brought it down to the line and repeated on the other side. I'm going to add some other bevels to this that'll remove weight from the bottom and also get rid of the sapwood from the blank. The sapwood is just as strong as the heartwood, but I just want this whole thing to look like chocolate. So I do this the same as the taper. Once everything's marked out, I go at it with the scrub plane and then I switch to the jointer plane when I'm pretty close to bring it home. Now I drill the hole for the screw. This would have been a lot easier if I'd done it before I assembled the bench and when the chop blank was still square, but sometimes I struggle with foresight. Installing it was very straightforward. I just screwed in the hardware basically. Then I made 2 cuts at the top of the vise chop. The first is a 45 that's going to provide clearance for my hands and tools to work on whatever I'm working on whenever I stick it in here. The second is to cut the top of the chop level with the workbench top because I find it's always easier to cut long and then cut things flush then cut it exact and try to finagle things into perfect positioning. Now, leg vices need something to keep the bottom from tipping in while you tighten it against whatever is in the top of the vise. I took a 1-inch dowel and then drilled holes in it that I can put in pins to serve as a stop, and that'll keep the chop upright when I use it. Now, this dowel needs to get glued to the chop and have a hole in the bench. So first I drilled the hole through the bench leg, and then I used a bit extension to drill through that hole to put the recess into the chop. That way I know everything's going to line up properly. Then I epoxied the dowel into the hole and applied a liberal amount of wax to the cross slide before putting it all back together and oiled up the vise. The only thing left is adding some leather to the vise faces. Now, this is about as necessary as dodging wrenches, but I did it anyways. And that's really it now. The bench is done. So thanks for watching, and don't forget I do have plans available for this that include the leg vise details, and some Patreon members get access to it for free. If you enjoyed this, please do like, comment, subscribe, as shares that does help a lot. And until next time, remember to make time to make something.